11th. Just a little housekeeping before we begin. The next meeting will be September 25th. Hi, guys. September 25th. And then we're altering October because of the election, so it will be October 16th, 4 to 6, and October 30th, 4 to 6 in the chamber. Okay, so October 16th, October 30th. I know Halloween, right? Is that Halloween or just 31st, right? Okay. You can wear your costume if you like, Russ. So the first one today is review of building height standards. I am going to open this one up for public comment for those that are here. So Travis, if you will kick us off.
Yes, ma'am, I'd be happy to. Good afternoon. And I'll be brief. Y'all heard this a couple weeks ago and sent staff away with one very specific question, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But a lot of this should still be fresh because you've seen this information previously. So we'll just kind of quickly go through the history of the item here, talk about the Planning Commission review and what happened during their review and recommendation, and then talk next steps. One thing to keep in mind as we have the conversation today, this is not an official text change. This is just a decision point for you as to whether or not you would like to authorize a text change. So even if the committee and later the city council decide to progress with this issue, that doesn't mean you're saying yes to the actual code language. It would ultimately come back to you at a later date at a public hearing. So this did arrive to the city council through petition of citizens. And the problem that was identified at the time was that there was some difficulty in achieving what's known as Class A office space construction, given the height standards that we have in the code today. This was referred to Planning Commission just as a discussion topic, and they've provided you with their review. Now, at the last meeting here, what was asked of staff was a little bit more context about how the Planning Commission recommendation occurred. So you might remember the Planning Commission formed a special purpose subcommittee where they reviewed the item, and that subcommittee reported back to the full Planning Commission. And at that meeting, there was some further discussion about the standards, and the recommendation was altered a little bit, and I'll walk through that in a second. So we always like to start out with what the problem is, and you remember that height in the city code is measured not only by number of stories, but also by maximum feet. And the issue that we've identified is that once you get to a 7-story building and above, you start to see compression in the floor-to-floor measurements for each story. So there's an ability to have what I'll call a little bit more lavish space, floor-to-floor space, in smaller buildings, in 3-story buildings, and 4- and 5-story buildings. But once you get to a 7-story building, that measurement compresses a little bit. So during the Planning Commission subcommittee, the review was to remove any measurement of feet in height at 12 stories, at 20 stories, and at 40 stories. There was a further recommendation to increase the maximum height at the 7-story level from 90 feet to 102 feet. And the subcommittee really had a great conversation about that, and they actually looked at the position of 7-story zoning as it related to residential zoning, and they were very particular about the impact that an increase in height might have in those locations. There were between a dozen and 20 different locations that they looked at, and felt that the increase to the measurement in feet in height would not pose a significant impact on adjacent residential zoning. So then that recommendation was delivered to the full Planning Commission, and they took a little bit further. So you see changes at the 7-story level here. So the total height in feet removed, recommended for removal. Increase in height at the 5-story level from 75 feet to 80 feet. And increase in height at the 4-story level from 62 to 68 feet. And you have information in your packet materials that contain the minutes from the actual meeting, so you can see the context for why those changes were made. And I believe there are folks in the audience that were at the meeting as well that could speak further to that.
I want to go on record as saying, if you go back to the previous slide, I want to go on record in saying that I do not support increasing the height of 4 and 5 stories to 68 and 80 feet. I think it's too tall. And I have concerns even about the 50 feet for 3 stories, because when you have a large, massive building, 50 feet, a 50-foot very large building horizontally is just way too massive. And I have that going on right now, as you know, at Dunn Road and Falls of Neuse, and 50 feet might be fine for something that's a a smaller building. But when you have something that is the length of an entire block, it becomes very massive, and it is not human scale. It's not in scale with neighborhoods. And so I just want to go on record, I do not support increasing the height to 68 and 80 feet for 4 and 5. And I really think we need to do something with 3 stories as far as 50 feet. 50 feet might be fine if it's a smaller, more compact building. But once you start building something that's a block long, 50 feet just is out of scale with neighborhoods.
Could you go back to, thank you, Dave, Mr. Cox. Could you go back to the slide previous, that was from the PC?
This is from the subcommittee, yes, ma'am.
Subcommittee? Okay. So was there a lot of conversation? I know we have some information in our backup book as it relates to the meeting itself, but was there more contextual information, I know it's been a while, to why they would want to make that many changes in 3, 4, and 5?
So you're stretching the limits of my memory a little bit because that was discussed a little bit earlier this year. But my recollection was it was just conversation that occurred between the commission and the interested parties, and the increase from this recommendation to that one just provided a little bit more flexibility in the construction type.
Okay, thank you.
And just one last slide for you here. Again, no text change has been authorized, so any action coming out of this committee and the city council would be, if you're ready to proceed, would be to authorize text change. And ordinance has already been drafted. That was part of the work that the Planning Commission did. Obviously, dependent upon feedback that's received from the committee and the council, if you'd like to see some changes to it, we'd be happy to listen to that and make changes and then forward to the Planning Commission. Ultimately would come back to you at the city council table as a public hearing. Happy to answer any more questions. I know you want to hear from the public, but I'm available for you.
Yeah, just stay available.
Yes, ma'am.
So, Mr. Whitehouse, I knew it would be you, and it's certainly open for anyone else who would like to speak.
Hi, good afternoon. Joe Whitehouse, 6109 Iris Drive, Raleigh. It was almost the day 3 years ago when we brought this forward. Scott and I brought this forward as a citizen's petition to the council. So it's almost had its 3rd birthday today. We could have had a cupcake, perhaps. Just to kind of go back through a little bit of reminder why we're here today too, is that the current UDO requirements with the max height included, was put in at the very end of the UDO itself. And I think it was not looked at in terms of some unintended consequences in terms of what was going on. Because really what's happening is it sort of puts an artificial cap on stories today. If we're going to follow some modern building techniques today that we're finding for our office buildings with floor-to-floor heights, the desires of tenants, trying to get all the mechanicals in above the ceiling, as we know, those are hard, and I'm sure Councilman Thompson can confirm that sometimes we struggle hard getting all these things coordinated above the ceiling. And so we're trying to create basic modern buildings that will keep us competitive in the marketplace, competitive with our peer markets out there today, and try to meet the needs of our tenants as we go through. Also, we want to try to allow some flexibility for design within our buildings as well. Try to create a little more height on the first couple floors, the pedestrian levels, where perhaps we have some retail and some other uses on the first couple floors that wouldn't normally be a part of the upper floors themselves. We want to try to create some variety in our skyline through the city itself, where everything is not the same height throughout the whole city. So I'd really like to go back and just encourage you to look at adding much what the Planning Commission has looked at today to move it forward. I personally think that we've given information in the past with some of the floor-to-floor heights that even the 5-story probably should be moved up to 85 feet to be able to meet some of the building standards that we'd like to have in our current buildings today. I'd like you to think about going ahead and continuing with, deleting the height as suggested for 7 stories and up, which we know that most of those are in areas that really don't back up to residential areas today as well. And want to just ask you to move this out of council and move back to the planning commission and keep the process going, and maybe we can celebrate something on its 4th birthday. Well, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Whitehouse?
But appreciate your proposal, and certainly noted in particular your comment about 7 stories and up not typically being near residential. I'm just wondering how that distinction might relate to what Councilor Cox just brought up about massive long buildings that are in the
3 to 5 stories.
5-story range. Obviously, there's a residential infill transition typically in those, and so it's 50 feet and then 40 feet and then 1-to-1 going back.
I think we also have some blank wall requirements and some other architectural wall requirements today that sort of help with those large masses of the projects themselves as well.
Yeah.
Well-
No, well, just let me.
Rules of articulation.
So,
Articulation, sure.
Yeah, certainly, blank wall. But even if you have lots of fenestration and little offsets every now and then, still, if you have a 200-foot-long building that's 50 feet high or more, you don't see that as an undesirable characteristic next to residential?
It's hard to answer that without
I
having
know,
a
I
particular
just-
site really in mind in terms of what's going on. So I'm not sure I can answer that one.
So you don't see any scenario where a very long monolithic building would present particular problems in terms of adjacency to residential?
Well, again, I think you'd have to look at each individual case, but I think with setbacks and landscaping and certainly with articulations and other items as well, I think you could probably work on those. And of course, if it's a rezoning, obviously we do a lot of work with the neighborhoods in terms of how to approach that as well.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
I do just have a, not a question for you, but just comment in general. In our committee, we're looking at allowing compatible development in the 50-foot no-build in return for a detached frontage designation, which actually would limit the massiveness of an individual project.
Okay, good.
And so that would be the trade-off. Smaller individual footprints in return for more compatible development in the 50-foot no-build, but that suggests that massiveness is not necessarily something we want to look for next to residential.
Okay.
I think we need to, I have no problem with 7 and above removing those height restrictions and actually sending that forward to council as a recommendation. But for 3, 4, and 5, I think we need to have much more discussion about height as it relates to the massiveness of the building, and see what we can do to regulate that better.
But you realize that today our discussion is not about,
We can send a recommendation back to council that we need to have that looked at, and I'm happy to bring that up as a council concern. But because we have no control or relationship between height and massiveness of 3, 4, and 5-story buildings, I do not support at this time approving an increase in height at those stories.
so you would be more inclined to 3, 4, and 5 to leave them as they were originally?
Until we can have further discussion, yes.
And I would support that as well.
I mean, what we have going on at Dunn and Falls of News is on the ground, it's being constructed, it is an abomination in my opinion. I have gotten nothing but complaints about this thing being constructed there. It's just a big massive wall along Dunn Road. And people are not happy about it. It is a perfect example of what should not be built in a residential area. Now, they might be fine on Hillsborough Street, or it might be fine downtown in various places. But when you get into District B, which is entirely outside the belt line, and you get into these suburban areas, the kinds of standards for construction that are used inside the Beltline do not carry forward into our suburban areas.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cox. Someone else who would like to speak? If not, I'm going to bring it back to the table. I think one of the things that, just for a conversation, I currently have a rezoning that's coming at the corner of South Saunders Street and Maywood, and it is at a residential area, and it is at 12 stories. So I think as the city grows, we're going to see more of that happening. To Russ's point, what's in his committee might give us a better interpretation of that no-build area, what we might be able to do. But I do think that it does exist, and those opportunities to do 12 stories up and against neighborhoods is going to happen. I mean, we have one proposed now. Mr. Thompson?
Yes, ma'am. So, you know, I'm in agreement that as far as taking off the height restrictions on 7 and above, I certainly don't have a problem with that. And I'm certainly also sensitive to the fact with builders and developers as far as needing more floor-to-floor, space. But I'm also sensitive to the fact about what you're talking about, David. And so I'm wondering if there's a way we can accomplish both of these by perhaps limiting it to certain zoning districts.
Well, the problem is that what's being built on Dunn Road is actually zoned NX.
And it backs up to
But it's across the street from residential.
not adjacent to, not
It doesn't back right up to it, no. But it is directly across the street, and it is in the entrance of Dunn Road, which goes into a residential area. And so something that is more compatible with the area, that is compatible with residential is what I'm looking for. So I don't think you can just restrict it by zoning district. I think you have to take a look at it and say, well, if you want greater options through greater height, then fine. Don't build it at such a massive building. Keep it smaller.
Ken, can you come up for a minute? Ken, so looking at our way to sort of figure out in terms of 7 and lower, people's concerns about the massiveness of a building versus the height of a building, do we have anything in the standards today that speaks to that through any, I thought through articulation or something like that, but do we have things that speak to that today?
We don't have anything that would cause you for a building with a very long facade to vary the height of it in the code today. If we were to add something like that, it would go into the Chapter 3 section on height. I think that's 3.5.
I mean, ideally, it would be, instead of one big, long building, it would be several smaller buildings that perhaps have greater height variability to be able to do some more interesting things. But then you have space between them, so that it's not just, looks like the wall on the Mexican border. I mean,
So, I would say, looking at this table, which Travis presented to you, the issue where all of a sudden the allowable floor-to-floor height is dramatically lower, it kicks in with 7 stories. And notwithstanding some discussion of greater flexibility for buildings of 3, 4, and 5 stories, I am not aware of particular issues for development projects that have come through the review process for buildings that are zoned at those height. So, but where we have heard that you cannot get the yield in stories is for these higher heights when it's an office building. And you had an original subcommittee review that proposed keeping the status quo for 3, 4, and 5 stories, and raising it for 7, and then eliminating the height and fee for 12, 20, and 40, and then you had further full commission review. But these are all options that are on the table. My suggestion at this point, given where this discussion is, if there's a desire to study how we can get varied heights or less monolithic approach for buildings of a certain, that have a certain facade length, that is an idea that is new to this discussion and doesn't necessarily have to move in tandem with the more immediate problem of dealing with the heights in these 7 to 40 story categories.
Okay.
And so it may be that a recommendation such as the original subcommittee recommendation is something that the committee could feel comfortable with, because it preserves the status quo. I understand that there are some issues with the status quo and a desire to improve it, but it doesn't worsen it from the standpoint of scale and massing of buildings in in the 3 to 5 story categories.
Well, I mean, we have what has been told to us all along. We have a form-based code. And form should consider more than just height. It should also consider the massiveness of the buildings. And that really needs to be looked at. And so I do not recommend changing any heights at this time for 3, 4, and 5.
So I think, Mr. Cox, I think what you brought up is an interesting exercise for staff to perhaps look at. So why don't you bring that up under council concerns?
That's fine.
And see if that's something the council can support, and have the planning, have staff look at it and bring it back to council. So I'm going to recap basically what we discussed at the last meeting. I think there was a conversation going on about whether you measure it in height or feet. And I think there were some thoughts that people at 7 and below still like it in feet, while anything above 7, I think there was an overall feel that could just be in stories. We haven't talked about that yet, but is that still some of the thoughts here at the table?
Yeah, that was one of my concerns, that, to the average person telling me, it's X stories high without understanding how tall that was, it's like, how long is a piece of string? How tall is a story? But I agree that, once we get past 3, 4, and 5, it's probably difficult for somebody to visualize anyway. So I think we need the feet in height in feet and stories for 3, 4, and 5, but I'd be okay with just stories after that.
So,
Mr. Thompson.
Question, Ken, and Joe, you're right. I think this has been kicked around for a couple of years now, so 3, okay.
Yeah.
So how does the mezzanine fit into this?
We've already passed that one.
Okay, so there is a definition, I believe, of a mezzanine in the code that has to take up less than half of the floor print of the building in order to be considered a mezzanine. In the 3, 4, and 5 story buildings, that still is subject to the upset limit of the height. You could conceive in the taller categories, perhaps gaining some extra floor space within the building by having a mezzanine level. But again, once you're in the realm of 12 and 20 story buildings, it's not a dramatic change. And I think the thinking from the commission and from some others is that where we find such tall heights mapped, notwithstanding the pending zoning case at Herb Seafood, but where it's actually mapped on the ground today tends to be in places where it's not directly adjacent to neighborhoods, because they're mostly mapped in places where there's some ample distance, because it's generally been our policy not to map such tall heights, and therefore the extra height and feet is not going to have a major impact on adjacent properties, because it's a place where tall buildings are located.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Stevens?
I'm ready to go with the subcommittee recommendation.
So can you make a motion?
Well, let me look at it one more time, make sure I'm picking the right one. No? Okay. I mean, I'm seeing a,
This one doesn't need to
This
have
is what
another
came out of the
birthday.
subcommittee here.
No, that's not
And this
the
is
one.
what was recommended by the planning commission.
okay, well, I guess I'm not on either of those. I'm
Go back to
taking
the-
off the heights for 7 and up and leaving the heights for 5 and below. That's my motion.
Second.
Second.
I don't want this one to have another birthday in my committee. So, second and motion, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Z 2518, 4315 Lead Mine Road.
Now, I didn't really say that we would, the recommendation is just to begin authorizing the text change, but I guess everybody understands that, right?
Oh, yeah, I didn't say it that way, to move forward with the text change.
Okay.
I'm sorry. It's right here in my big notes, sorry.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So this is a rezoning case that was back before you, the committee, a couple months ago. Committee had explored a couple particular topics. The applicant since then has been doing some work to address those. They haven't been able to formally file any revised conditions because the public hearing is still open, so I'll let the applicant talk through what they have in mind, and then staff will be available if there are any questions or desire for feedback on some of those conditions. So I'll be brief, just wanted to recap the request and the status. So this is at Crabtree Mall, right along Glenwood Avenue. It's called Lead Mine Road, but it's at the intersection essentially of Lead Mine and Glenwood Avenue. So the request is to go from CX12 to CX7. So on the face of it, a reduction in height also limits retail uses, but does expand residential, and I'll outline that in a table. But that's to explain why it looks like a down zone on the face of it. It's consistent overall with the plan, future land use map, Planning Commission, and the CAC recommended approval. So obviously y'all are familiar with this. One thing I would note just really quickly, there were some questions last time about the length of the frontage of the site to help understand condition that related to tree conservation. So it's about 1,000 feet. So the tree conservation condition as written right now talks about 12,000 feet along that Glenwood frontage. So on average, you would be looking at about 12 feet. In reality, would be actually a little bit deeper than that, because that doesn't account for the fact that you would have some pedestrian passages and other ingress that would be subtracted from that. So I won't go through all these conditions. I'll hit a couple of the key ones. So a maximum of 350 dwelling or hotel units would allow 45,000 square feet of office space. To the extent there is any office space, that is then subtracted from the residential entitlement. And then the other, we talked about the tree conservation that's been specified. Also, they've specified some pedestrian paths that would provide access down to Glenwood Avenue.
Is that out onto the sidewalk, right?
Yes. So the big comparison then is shown in this table. So height would be, effectively, there's a condition that reduces it, to 9 stories. Currently, so the request is for 7, so a little bit of a reduction there. Again, an increase in the maximum number of dwelling units, decrease in permitted retail from 125,000 to 10,000. So those are the primary changes. Future land use map is community mixed use, so consistent with what's envisioned there. It's in a growth center, and the form recommendations that they've included in the form of conditions and the zoning are consistent with that desire for urban form. So the topics that have been discussed at the June committee meeting involve some concerns, questions about stormwater, transportation impact, tree conservation area, and housing affordability. So I would, again, just remind that they can't formally file conditions until the hearing is closed. That will come back to council next week. It's continued to the 17th. So at that point, if it closes, they can formally file those conditions. I anticipate that they will talk through them this afternoon. And so if there are any questions or desire for feedback from staff, we'll be available for that.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Okay. Beth?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and City Council members. Beth Trejos, Nelson Mullins, here today on behalf of Coda Reedies, and I've got a PowerPoint presentation of my own. I'm going to try to get open up here. Okay. So, and I want to thank Jason. He's been a wonderful resource through this process, and he took you through a lot of the overview. I know it's been since June that we were last before you, and since we're talking about birthdays, I should tell you that we too have a September birthday. We turned 1 yesterday. We started this process with a staff meeting in May of last year, and have been working with staff and with you since then. As Jason said, Jason sort of went through the overview of uses. I won't make you listen to that again. I'll jump straight to the changes that we've made since the last meeting, and also share just a little bit of an overview with you about the company, my client, Coterides. Pete Coterides is here. It's a family-owned private company out of Virginia. They have 4 apartment complexes in Raleigh. 3 are existing complexes, and 1 is under construction on Trinity Road. These are not downtown-style, high-end projects. They are attainably priced projects. The current rents in the 3 operating Raleigh projects range from $930 to $1,475. So those are very attainable price points. This site is one that is in need of the apartments are badly dilapidated, and it is in need of renovation, and that is what Coterides is hoping to do on a wholesale basis. So what we have done since your last meeting are add conditions in draft, which we have shared with staff and discussed with staff, that prohibit tattoo parlors and body piercing, drive-through facilities, which was requested. We increased the tree conservation area from a minimum of 12,000 square feet to a minimum of 18,000 square feet. Less any right-of-way dedication for Glenwood Avenue. We think that will be minimal. We revised our stormwater condition and have approval from stormwater staff to address post-development peak flow rates for the 2, 10, 25, 50, and 100-year storm. And it includes a component that prohibits direct discharge to the west, which is the pipe that would flow towards the mall. So there's that commitment. Also heard from Councilor Stevenson about a concern about light infiltration, and so we have added a condition that any lighting on the parking structures would be installed to prevent it from being directed onto adjacent residentially zoned properties. We also, in our discussions with Councilor Thompson, heard some concerns about the access that is directly across from North Hills Drive. I'm going to just sort of jump ahead to a picture so that that shows that this access point here is what I'm talking about. Oh geez, and so we added a condition based on our discussions that would allow essentially a third of the site to have left-in access from lead mine. I think that was, as we understand it anyway, Councilor Thompson's concern that there might be some, as folks were turning left, there might be some backups that would cause an issue. And so we have tried to put some language in that would create, reduce that impact or that perceived impact. We also have relocated, let me see if I can, the pedestrian access point, which was something that was discussed at the last meeting. We originally had 2 access points, and there was a suggestion from Councilor Thompson that it would be better to have the ADA accessible access point here where there would be easy access to cross Glenwood Avenue. So we revised to have 1 pedestrian access point that'll generally follow this location. It will have the switchbacks so that it'll be ADA accessible and go right here onto the sidewalk and at the light so folks can cross over safely to the mall. And that will provide an opportunity for not only the folks who will in the future live in this apartment complex, but those folks who live north of the site as well, and to access the property. I would tell you that it's about a half mile from this site to the bus stop at Crabtree. So this is an existing, transit-friendly project. One of the things that we talked about in a private meeting with Councilor Thompson was density and a desire that density be reduced on the project. We are willing to do that. Our our thought, though, is that, at this location, with the designation of one of the most intense areas in the city, density is appropriate. The immediate accessibility to transit is appropriate. And in terms of other projects that have been approved in the area, we're actually a little bit lower in terms of density. The Overture, which is just to the north, has 201 units on 4.5 acres, which is 44 dwelling units to the acre. The factory at Crabtree North, which is also just to the north, was planned at 71 dwelling units to the acre. Crabtree Creek, which is that just above the mall project, kind of like the backdoor entrance, has 335 dwelling units on 7.1 acres, so that's at 47 dwelling units to the acre. So there are a number of projects in the area that are pretty intense. We're consistent with your future land use map. We received a recommendation for approval from the Northwest CAC and a unanimous recommendation for approval from the Planning Commission. We are here to receive your comments on our proposed conditions, and we are hopeful that you will join in supporting the project as well.
Thank you. So Beth, I think there's going to be some transportation questions asked by Mr. Thompson and other members, so we might have transportation staff come up next.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Stay close.
I'll be right here.
Is there transportation staff here? I know you have some.
Yeah.
Let's just go ahead and dive in.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about DOT's ideas about Lead Mine Road and Glenwood Avenue.
Is there a map I can point to that I can? Let's try this one. Nope. So NCDOT released a number of different potential configurations for the project at the interchange, generally in this area. And I think the scope of that project from NCDOT's point of view is generally understood to include something at that intersection. And some of those ideas were put out there in a public meeting not too long ago. And since then, NCDOT has put basically a halt work on this project as well as a number of other projects for a little while. So we're not going to know what NCDOT wants to do in this area for at least a few months and maybe a little bit longer. From what my memory was of those intersections, many of them those alternatives, many of them included some kind of grade separation at Blue Ridge, Lead Mine, and Glenwood, and some of them modified that whole intersection in the vicinity of North Hills and Lead Mine. But at this point, it's kind of all up to us to respond to and up to NCDOT to make decisions on and move forward. And it'll be a little while before we get any certainty there.
That's a very tight intersection for a grade separation.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So just a few comments. Thanks to Beth and to Pete, we've met a couple of times. We even went over to the site, and I think we've made a lot of progress on this. And I think it's a lot of it's for the betterment of not only for this property, but also for the 55-plus community that's just north of there, as far as getting down, adding the handicap ramps to get down to Marriott Drive down there, so they could cross over to Crabtree. I think that's a lot better. The stormwater, I've checked that box. I think we've gotten that one taken care of. Tree conservation, I'm certainly satisfied with that. We've been trying to work on this left turn, because that is a big issue when you come off Glenwood Avenue and go up there, because even, I think I told you, it backs up even now. And I think maybe trying to separate the property like we talked about, and having most of the folks going up on Marriott Drive as being your primary entrance, I think is better, except for maybe some of your your property down there behind PNC, and I think we could work that out. I'm just not comfortable with the language about what DOT. I think we need to work on that somehow to make it a little bit more defined, so we don't have an issue on Glenwood. It would back all the way up on the belt line. Because once it starts that cycle, it just gets worse. And we know that's a level 5, or whatever we call it. It's about the worst you can get intersection the city.
E.
Sorry?
It's an E.
E, okay. We don't want to make it any.
It's an F. It's an F.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right, I think it's an F.
That's the worst you can get. So we don't want to make it any worse. We need to work on that language, I think, for us to really feel comfortable about it. And as far as the density goes, and like we talked about it the other day, Pete, there is a lot of density around there, but it's kind of like the last man up to the plate. It's too much density right now. I mean, I believe a reasonable number would be 25 units per, 275 total. Because we are taking some other conditions on the zoning right now away, and that's that pedestrian bridge and other things that's already on there. So I think that's a reasonable trade-off.
So let me just make sure I understand, Beth, is there a decision or in your conditions that you do want to try to make a left-hand turn into this site as opposed to just having it that on Marriott Drive?
I didn't realize how tall Jason was.
You enlarge that somehow? That photograph?
I
No?
I have the one
Okay.
that maybe is a little bit better but, so what we had proposed is essentially that, roughly this part of the site, and maybe a little straighter like that, would have the ability to have left-in access, like this. And we would accomplish that by one-way streets and directional signage. And so, that was our proposal. I know Jason and I have been trying to get up with one another in terms of the language. We're happy to work on the language to make that something that is achievable and clear to everyone.
Beth, I travel in and out of that intersection. I think the city attorney actually lives in the area. I don't know how you make that left across Lead Mine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't physically know how you make it. The traffic there now stacks.
Yeah, I agree. And when you go up further up the hill, put a little line there where we're talking about most of the traffic coming in now, Beth, up
Oh,
there.
here, you mean?
Yes, yeah. And I think if that would be their primary entrance, that would certainly help out. But the one down there by North Hills Drive is the one that's so problematic.
I mean, I could see a right in there, but I just don't see how we...
Right in, right out down
Right.
there.
I just don't see how we achieve, I don't care what kind of signage you do, and I want to help your project, but I don't see how you can achieve a left there when at any given time, and it doesn't even have to be peak periods, just on an average, it is pretty stacked on Lead Mine to get in onto Glenwood or vice versa. I mean, I don't know how the rest of the council feels, but I drive it, and it is, it's a pretty tough intersection. I think there are 4 turn lanes in that intersection.
So the one thing that is attractive to us about that intersection, and to me as a driver, I also drive this area all the time. My office is in Glen Lake, is that there's a traffic light there. And, given that there is significant movement in all directions in this area, the safety of a traffic light gives me comfort. And I think, other drivers may feel that way as well.
Yeah, but we've had discussion. We're going to try to make something work out here for this property. But the problem is, I'll be going home tonight. And when I take a right off Lead Mine, off of Glenwood onto Lead Mine, there's many times the cars are already backed up so far, I really can't turn because there's no place for me to go. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. So it would really be best And I know you've got the situation with cross access with PNC, I believe.
yeah.
So you have to deal with that, but it would be better if we could really get that traffic up there on Marriott Drive.
Yeah, that, so, in terms of our site is one thing. The hotel and PNC Bank have a right to use that driveway that we don't have the ability to impede from a legal perspective. I mean, they have a right there. We know that NCDOT is going to do something eventually here, and that's going to be binding on everybody.
Even if we decided today, hell, we can make that left turn there, I don't think we can, but it's ultimately an NCDOT road, is it not?
Yes.
That mine is.
Yep.
Yes.
They'll have to ultimately make the decision.
If I'm not mistaken, the only one that's not is North Hills and Century are both city-maintained streets, but Lead Mine, Blue Ridge, and Glenwood are all NCDOT maintained.
Okay.
So I'd just like y'all to take it back, continue working on that. Let's come back with that density where it needs to be, and let's do something with this left turn.
Okay, we will continue working with staff on that language and see if we can come up with something that will address your concerns. Will
Vicki,
we-
do you want it brought back to council or brought back to the committee?
Brought back here.
Yeah, brought back to the committee.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank y'all for, let's get it to where it is right now, because we were away when you first brought it in here.
Well, and that was a joint effort. Thank you for your time, everybody. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us and work with us.
Thank you, Beth. I'm sorry,
One
Mr.
question,
Stevenson.
just a clarification. You said that there's some by right access for PNC and the hotel to some access. Where was that?
Marriott.
So at the North Hills access here,
Yes.
it goes kind of like this
Right.
and like this.
Yeah.
And so there's a cross-access agreement with PNC as the beneficiary for one component and the hotel is the beneficiary for the other. And we can't impair their right on those cross-access easements.
Okay, I got it, thanks.
Thank you.
Chair, before you leave this one, you will need to consider making a recommendation to the council to
then
continue
push
the
it back.
hearing.
Yeah.
That's right.
Is
So
that what
the-
you were getting ready to say?
Yes,
'Cause
ma'am.
I thought so
Yeah,
too.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we need to make a recommendation to send it back to the council. So the motion needs to be to send it back to the council so that we can leave it open and then send it back to Growth and Natural Resources.
You don't necessarily need to do that, but you do have a hearing scheduled on the 17th.
17th.
If you want to continue that hearing, it has to be continued to a date
Certain.
date certain. So
Can I do that at the council table?
you
Yeah.
could.
Okay.
So you could keep it in the committee in advance of that and suggest that the hearing be continued.
I got it.
It looks like the next meeting would be your first
30th.
meeting in October.
October 16th.
If you were to schedule this at your next meeting on September 25th, then I think you could consider it at the council meeting on October 7th, I believe.
October 1st. Is it the 1st? I think it's the 1st. It is the 1st.
October 1st, that's right.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to be in Montreal on the 25th.
You're going to be in Montreal. Okay.
Is it possible to come to your next meeting?
Which is the 25th. We're having a council meeting
Will
on
that give you enough
Tuesday.
time?
Does that give you enough time?
Will that give you enough time?
The 17th?
Mm-hmm.
To revise,
The next meeting is the 25th.
25th,
Here.
2 weeks.
And that would,
Where you're out of town.
But she says she's going to be in Montreal.
So
What
your
would be
your
the
next
next one
meeting
after
prior to
that?
that would be October 16th.
right, my
Which-
meeting, October 16th. But the council meeting is October 1st, so it would have to be the second meeting in October
Okay.
of the council.
Yeah, if you wanted to have the date determined to be after the meeting, then you were going to consider it at committee, that would be the bearing.
Okay.
And the second council meeting in October is the 15th, so we
Yeah,
wouldn't
that's
hit
what
that
I'm
one
looking at.
either.
Yeah, we could, trying to accommodate your schedule and figuring out how to
No, I
get this in.
apologize.
So if she, yeah, that won't work.
We can work with you prior to the council meeting to work on a motion on the, whatever the continuance date is,
Yes,
and work
because
out the logistics
Working
behind the
out
scenes.
logistics with her schedule is going to be a little bit tough. It might be later in October before we can do that. We'll just reach out to you.
I appreciate it. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Plus, I don't know how many things we already have on the docket, so we need to check that out first. Next case, TCZ 119, 500 Spring Forest Road.
Madam Chair, I have questions about this case, because when we originally talked about what was planned for this meeting, this case was not on the agenda. And then I had a conversation with Molly Stewart, and she expressed concerns it wasn't on the agenda. And so I'm confused as to why it is on the agenda today. And I'm concerned because I've made promises to the residents and the neighbors that live near this property that I would notify them when it would come before this committee. And I've not been able to do that. So instead of getting into this case, because there are no neighbors here, I would ask that we defer this case until the next meeting, and then that would give me an opportunity to be able to notify them so that they can come and participate in this process.
I'm fine with that because I didn't see it on the agenda either when I looked at it.
Right.
No.
I can't speak to that. I could see it, so I'm not sure.
We can follow up technically. We have not modified the agenda since the agenda was published. So
That was a couple of days ago I checked it. Maybe I may be wrong, but I didn't see it on there.
yeah, we can follow up to see if it's a technical issue with.
On the public site?
On the public site, but no, the agenda was not modified after its publishing.
But regardless, I was not aware this was going to be on this meeting, and I therefore have not been able to notify anyone, and as a result, there are no neighbors here to be able to participate in this process.
So, Tansy, in terms of scheduling, could we schedule it for the 25th?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay.
I see you all sitting out there in the audience. I'm sorry, since seems to be some technical mix-up or delay, in fairness to all parties, I think moving it to September 25th is a better solution, but I appreciate your coming down today. Thank you. Okay, any other questions? If not, the meeting is adjourned. I can't.